he's going right across my deck here now. I did not right up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is good too, Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything. Over.
Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name is Taylor. I'll be one of your hosts today. Tanner will be joining me here in just a few seconds, but first, and most importantly, we have a patron to shout out, Captain Trey. Thank you for signing up. I hope you enjoy the bonus content, and we appreciate it. With that done, let's go ahead and bring in Tanner. Tanner, what's up? How are things going in Wisconsin?
Oh, it was good. Yesterday, I podcasted for 6 hours.
Yeah, you texted me about that.
None of it was for this show. Well, I mean, it kind of is. It's like a crossover type episode with Kelly from Born Under Punches.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very long, very twisty, turny, epic story. Won't come out for a while, but when it does, we'll be sure to share that with all of you. Very fun story. I cannot wait for everyone to hear it.
Interesting. I'm excited to hear this.
Three of our favorite things, really. Shipwrecks, swindlers, and Canada.
Okay. Just around the Great Lakes, you could probably find quite a bit of that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Gordon Lightfoot songs kind of written about those things. What else have you been up to? What kind of media stuff have you been up to?
Well, one thing I did was I watched a movie. The movie that we are going to cover for our bonus episode that we're going to record tomorrow.
Uh-huh.
That was the movie The Admiral, Roaring Currents, or its Korean title is just Myeongnyang, just the name of the battle it depicts. So keep a lookout for that. If you're a patron of the show, you'll be getting that in hopefully the next 2 days after we record this one.
You'll probably have it by the time you hear this.
Yeah, by the time you hear this, it'll be out. Ignore all of this time schedule talk. Other than that, reading-wise, I'm reading a book called Waco Rising by
Timothy McVeigh.
By Timothy McVeigh, written posthumously. It's weird that that's one of the first that's one of the first news stories I remember is not the Oklahoma City bombing, but his execution. I very clearly remember the TV being on and seeing Terre Haute, Indiana at the prison that he was being executed at. But anyway, this book, Waco Rising, is subtitled David Koresh, the FBI, and the Birth of America's Modern Militias. So, it's good. I'm enjoying it. However, it's basically just a book about Waco.
Oh.
I kind of expected Waco to be more of the
introduction that...
Sort of, yeah. I kind of expected it to occupy less of the book. That is a well-documented story. And the book kind of presents itself to be about more than just that. And it does cover those things. Because it's getting into, obviously, the basis of that. What got me to this book was, I had mentioned I had just read Columbine, which I really, really enjoyed. But the Columbine attack itself, rather than being a quote-unquote successful school shooting, Harris and Klebold would have seen it as a failed bombing. That's what they really wanted to do. They wanted something that would outdo Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City itself, a terroristic homage to the Waco siege. So all of those things kind of tie together. So I was looking to read more about Waco, not just the siege itself, but its influence.
I feel like in that story frame that way, Waco is the least interesting part of that.
It's something that is just very well documented because they're survivor stories. There's the FBI, the ATF documentation of it. It's a very interesting story, especially for the space it occupies in current American history and how it kind of spurs this militia movement. Timothy McVeigh is tied into Waco. Timothy McVeigh is literally there at the Waco siege.
Literally there.
Selling anti-government merchandise and hats and books. He's the Turner Diaries, he's selling copies of this out of the back of his truck. And so how all those things are really tied together is really interesting. Again, it is a good book. There's stuff in it that I hadn't seen before about Waco. Getting close to halfway. But yeah, it's a good read. Not exactly what I thought it was going to be.
Nice.
What about you?
Oh, what have I done? No Waco. Haven't done any Wacos. I went to a Kids Bop concert.
That's the opposite of the Waco siege.
No, there were some kids at Waco.
There was music too.
Yeah, there was music. Yeah.
David Koresh was a musician too.
See, it actually wasn't that bad. The Kids Bop concert, not Waco.
Waco was pretty bad. The Kids Bop concert, okay.
Yeah, not so bad. Didn't expect this much Waco content, honestly.
More like wacko content. You ever heard about this David Koresh guy?
So it was actually at the Ohio State Fair. So that was kind of cool. It wasn't just a Kids Bop concert. Got to go to the Ohio State Fair. It unfortunately doesn't hold a candle to the... I saw the skeptical look on your face. It doesn't hold a candle to the Wisconsin State Fair. Not nearly enough cheese, not enough cows. Beer was $9 a can. And that was enough for me to not want any. I thought that was ridiculous. Even at the Reds games, it's not $9 for just a can of beer.
$9, it is pretty crazy where we are price-wise as a country. Makes you so angry you could bomb a federal building.
So yeah, that was one thing that we did. It was fun. It was a good first concert for the kids and everything. The quality was pretty good. The production value was pretty high. So like it had that going for us. I also didn't realize that there's a couple famous celebrities and stuff that were Kids Bop kids.
It's like the Mickey Mouse Club for singers. Like,
kind of.
I guess the Mickey Mouse Club is the Mickey Mouse Club for singers also.
Yeah, that too. I forgot they listed off some famous alumni. I'm blanking on them right now, but like there were names that I knew, and I'm not that plugged into that kind of thing.
Johan Hegg from Amon Amarth.
Yeah. So now that you mention it,
Kids Bop concert. So what are you seeing? What's on stage? Is it like a band with instruments?
Children.
Is it a choir type thing?
No, it's like they do modern songs.
I know, but like are the kids playing instruments?
No, they're just singing. Like it's like watching like a boy band almost.
Okay. Are there instruments on stage?
No.
Okay.
No.
I'm just very curious about what the kids
It
are
would
doing.
be like going to like an NSYNC concert.
Okay.
But with children.
Okay. I've been to a +1 concert.
Similar to that. The other thing I've been up to is NCAA Football 25.
Mm-hmm.
This is a game I've waited, 11 years for?
It's been a long time.
Patiently. And it's probably the most played game of my youth. I put a lot of time into the various college football games that I had. I like it because you can just start your dynasty and recruit your players, and you just never have to care again about anything else because you're in your own little world.
Yeah.
It's fun.
It's fun in a way that Madden isn't. Franchise mode Madden. College football, I remember, I guess was it NCAA 06? I think was the first one that I probably really played a lot.
That's the one I think I got for my birthday when I got a PlayStation 2 back in the day. And like that felt game changing. Like that one was really cool. That was where, you finally have all this deep recruiting and stuff. And that's when I kind of fell in love with it. Like I prefer college football to NFL football. If I, just have to watch a random game, I'd rather watch a college game. But I love both. But the college football games have always been like the thing that's been most fun for me. This new version isn't perfect. There's definitely some bugs and things that need to get worked out. But I think a lot of it is stuff that can be patched, I hope. It's more about, do you trust EA to actually do it? And I don't. But
I have not played the game yet, but I've seen enough clips of it online that I feel like I kind of have from people sharing on Twitter. I think maybe the college football game, like college football itself, is flawed in many major ways, but never going to lose its appeal.
That's a pretty good way to look at it. Also, like, people are acting like the 2014 version was perfect. And like, it definitely wasn't. I remember having glitchy, weird things happen all the time back in the day.
That was the one with Robert Griffin III on it, wasn't it?
I think so.
I remember playing that in my studio apartment in Centerville.
So yeah, that's what I've been up to. I've got a created player that I'm working through, and then a dynasty. It's fun seeing a lot of other people get into it. I know Tom from 10,000 Losses has been starting his dynasty with Temple to turn them into a powerhouse. So it's been fun to see. Well, I guess we'll do the thing we're all gathered here to do, and that is talk about a shipwreck. Today, we will be talking about the Liscome Bay. Have you ever heard of the Liscome Bay?
Well, yes, because I'm reading that Ian Toll book. the conquering tide.
We had pretty fortunate timing, I think, on this one, that I texted you about what I was doing. I was like, if you see it, I know you're reading a book about the Pacific. If you see any interesting quotes, like, let me know. And like, you're like, I am exactly at that part of the book.
Mm-hmm.
So the Liscome Bay was a Casablanca-class escort carrier. She's constructed by Kaiser Shipbuilding of Vancouver, Washington. And I want to be clear, this is Vancouver, Washington, not Vancouver, British Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
This is the one that's located just north of Portland, Oregon.
You're telling me the Kaiser built this ship?
The Kaiser built this ship.
That's probably not good.
No, probably not. So the Casablanca class is notable for being the first purpose-designed escort carrier. We'll get into what an escort carrier is in a minute. Previously, these had all been conversion projects. Another interesting thing here is that it's all prefabricated. This gave the class the standardized dimensions of 520 feet in length, a 65-foot beam, and a draft of almost 21 feet. She actually gets her name from Liscome Bay, which is on Dahl Island in the Alexander Archipelago of Alaska.
We talked about the Alexander Archipelago briefly in our bonus episode on Russian maritime misadventures in the colonization of Alaska.
I thought that one sounded familiar.
That's where, like, Juneau is.
Is it? A lot of the ships in the class are named after bodies of water. There's so many of these ships. There's a Makin Island. So the vessels were designed to hold 27 aircraft. And that's kind of just their functional amount of aircraft as far as it operating as an aircraft carrier. They actually have hangar space for more. And part of the reason for that is that she could be used as like a transport almost. Like if you've got to deliver aircraft into theater, you can do that with a carrier like this because it's a lot, you can't just take a flight of 10 F4 Avengers and fly them from California to Iwo Jima, right? Like you've got to get them there physically. And that's a role that these ships kind of occupy. But they're also very functional. Like you can also operate them as a true aircraft carrier and like do support operations and stuff. So during her deployment, the Liscome Bay would carry a total of 28 aircraft, kind of one over what's like quote unquote normal. But I'm sure like anything else, you always have a little space and a little slack in the system. So this grouping of aircraft, what they're working with is 11 FM-1 Wildcats. And all that is a Wildcat fighter with extra bombs and fewer guns. So more of like an assault type thing. If you're doing landing operations and you're trying to take out a bunker or a hardened position, obviously guns, you'll trade guns for bombs. They also had 5 traditional F4F Wildcat fighters, which is going to be more of an air coverage type thing.
A female for female Wildcat?
Yes. They also had 12 TBM-1 Avengers. So like more of a bomber type aircraft, torpedo attack, that kind of thing.
Something interesting from reading those Ian Toll books, which are very good. I highly recommend them. I don't really know that much about airplanes. But hear about the reputation of Japan's Zero fighter and how at the beginning of the war it's just shredding Allied planes because it's more maneuverable, it can climb faster, and it can just outmaneuver any Allied plane in a dogfight. And it is interesting to see how quickly the Americans develop tactics to counteract that, saying, okay, well, if it's going to beat us in a dogfight, then let's not dogfight with a Zero. Stick together, work with your squadron mates, and these things are pretty easy to destroy. Like one burst into the wing root is gonna obliterate a Zero.
The Zero is like a true interceptor. Like that is what that's all it's meant to do.
It cannot handle a lot of punishment. And so like with the Wildcat, they have to use these sort of like team tactics to take down these Zeros. Whereas like once they roll out the Hellcat, it's like, oh shit, like this is a real fighter. Like this is something we can outduel pretty much anything in the sky with these.
Well, and then you accompany that with the fact that every pilot Japan loses isn't being replaced, whereas the US is putting more and more and more capable pilots into the field.
That was another eye-opening thing is Japan loses, in these operations. It's like even when they lose comparable amounts of planes, the US is recovering a lot more of their aviators from the water, whereas Japan
Mhm.
simply isn't. If your veteran pilots get shot down on the Japanese side, like they're probably gone, whereas the US are able to recover a lot more of these experienced veteran pilots.
When you think about like all the training and time, you're talking about probably millions of dollars and hundreds or thousands of hours going into training one pilot.
Mm-hmm.
It is definitely worth plucking them out of the water.
Mm-hmm.
So in total, there were 50 ships in the Casablanca class, and these would all be completed in the span of 2 years. That's pretty crazy. Like the wartime production that went on in this country is pretty staggering when you think about it.
Yeah, like it's crazy looking at like taking that initial blow at Pearl Harbor and then a few like minor reversals. Just the raw production power is pretty crazy.
So of these 50 vessels, 5 of them would be lost to enemy action. And unfortunately, none of the 45 survivors exist today. They were all scrapped. So often we see that like, wouldn't it be such a cool museum ship to be able to walk through one of these?
Well, and it's like how in a retrospective look at things makes everything seem more valuable, whereas at the time, these are like fast, cheap, small carriers we can crank out. Probably a lot less sentimentality connected to them.
So these vessels would earn the nickname Jeep carriers or Kaiser Jeeps. They're not as extensively armored as a quote-unquote real carrier. They're not meant to take the punishment that a real carrier is. They're semi-disposable, as we're seeing here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're prefabricated. It's the trade-off you make with it being quick and easy to produce.
Mm-hmm.
They were also slow. Again, another trade-off that you make for being able to increase your economies of scale here and get it done. They're only able to make 19 knots, whereas the Yorktown class could do 32 and a half.
Wow.
So that's a pretty significant difference. So you might be asking, like, what do these small, slow, lightly armored vessels do? The original idea is that these vessels would sail with convoys and provide protection. Thinking about like the air gap and stuff that existed in the Atlantic, one of the only things that the submarines feared were airplanes. And if you can keep airplanes up the entire way, that's a good way to keep submarines from attacking your convoy. Biggest role that they would play for the Americans is that they would provide escorts to the amphibious landings that were going to take place in the Pacific. This allowed large carriers to be freed up for larger, more strategic operations. And, you know, you don't want to put all your resources into one place. This is allowing you to disperse things. And even if you hypothetically lost one of your main carriers, if you've got 4 or 5 of these around, you can still operate an air operation. Another one of their main roles is something we've already touched upon, and that was to ferry aircraft into the Pacific theater. Often these vessels would transport aircraft that couldn't even take off from their decks. And, you know, that also includes bringing back damaged or things that are going to be scrapped, or, you know, even something as silly or as unique as, well, we've captured these enemy aircraft. We want to check them out. Well, how do you get those back to the United States?
Oh, right.
You know, there's a lot of different uses here for these vessels. That's kind of why they get the nickname Jeep, because they are such a general purpose thing when it comes to aviation. So let's move on to active service. She is commissioned on August 7th, 1943. Captain Irving Wiltsey was placed in command, and her crew came from the escort carrier USS Glacier, which was a Bogue-class escort carrier that was being sent to the UK under the Lend-Lease program. So that kind of makes sense. Like, you've already got a trained crew that knows kind of what's going on. There's not that many differences class to class. The operation's still the same. You know, you move them over and you send this one to the British. One of the sailors on board worth noting is a name that some people might be familiar with, a cook by the name of Doris Miller. Are you aware of Doris Miller?
Cuba Gooding Jr.
Yes. Hold on. What's that? I think World War II just started.
I think World War II just started. World War II, World War II, World War II, World War II.
So Miller had been awarded a Navy Cross for his actions during Pearl Harbor on board the USS West Virginia. This is depicted in Pearl Harbor by Cuba Gooding Jr. when World War II just started.
Is the Navy at this point integrated, semi-integrated?
Semi. I think they're the most, I believe, at the time.
Like in this situation, he's he's a cook. So like I'm assuming maybe like non-combat roles.
Support roles, I think, is the way it would be
Okay.
described. But also, I mean, he has a battle station. Like, he has responsibilities when things are going on. So it's not...
Everybody's kind of a combat role, I guess.
Yeah, but like as far as jobs, like I think they are very capped and limited as to what those jobs and opportunities are going to be. He would not be in command of any white sailors, for sure.
Like I would imagine like it would only be enlisted positions also.
Yeah, I would imagine. So just beginning the laundry for the day, Miller reported to his battle station only to find that it had been destroyed.
Oh, I guess that's something we didn't point out. We assumed a lot of knowledge. Doris Miller is black.
Oh, yeah, that is true. Yes, he is. That's why this is notable. Also, I'm assuming that you know that Pearl Harbor is happening right now. He's beginning laundry when that happens. So he reports to his battle station, and he finds out that it's destroyed. He doesn't have a battle station. He then reports to a nearby officer, and he's told to help assist moving the wounded captain of the vessel. That is Mervyn Binion. He's actually mortally wounded in the chest. So Doris Miller is assisting with the wounded. He also assists with the captain. The captain of the vessel is actually continuing to issue orders and inquire about the ship until he ultimately dies on the bridge. And that actually frees up Miller to go do something else now. He reports back, and he's ordered to assist in the loading of a pair of mounted .50 caliber machine guns. The thing is, he doesn't know how those work. He's never been trained on those. He was just trying to do his laundry. Fortunately, the lieutenant who ordered him to assist was able to show him how the weapon worked. The lieutenant then turned to show another sailor, the other gun. And when the lieutenant turns back around, he's shocked to see that Miller's already firing the gun and trying to shoot down airplanes and reloading the weapon. So he figures that he's good to go.
Very fast learner.
He did not tell him to shoot. He only expected him to load, and Doris Miller said, "Watch this." Miller then fired the weapon until he ran out of ammo. He was then ordered to move more wounded, and the West Virginia would later sink in shallow water, and at that point, Miller's ordered to abandon ship. Obviously, the United States is looking for any sort of a hero in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. It must have been truly like pretty remarkable what Miller did, because I don't think that the U.S. government would have picked him if they could have. But the fact that he is given a Navy Cross for this is pretty cool, just because, you know, there have been African-American soldiers and sailors for a while, but there's a lot of examples of them getting passed over and, you know, not being recognized for doing really brave things. So it's pretty cool to see this. The citation for his actions that day reads as follows.
For distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his own personal safety during the attack on the fleet in Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii, by Japanese forces on December 7th, 1941. While at the side of his captain on the bridge, Miller, despite enemy strafing and bombing, and in the face of a serious fire, assisted in moving his captain, who had been mortally wounded, to a place of greater safety, and later manned and operated a machine gun directed at enemy Japanese attacking aircraft until ordered to leave the bridge.
So yeah, that's pretty cool to see that happen. He was a pretty big celebrity after this. He's involved in some of like the war bond drives and things like that, and that makes sense in the sense that although there's a lot of prejudice and things going on, African Americans still made a large part of the population, and in the most cynical of ways, you want their money for the war bonds too, right? So,
well, yeah, I was gonna say like U.S. government's kind of in a position where it's like, hey, I know we haven't been the nicest to you,
but like we need your help and some money. So, the West Virginia would end up being raised and returned to service later in the war, and after that, Miller would be assigned to the USS Indianapolis on December 13th, 1941. Absolutely cursed ships this man gets put on.
Well, I guess in the case of Pearl Harbor, it's like it didn't really matter what ship you were on. Like, it was probably getting attacked.
And the West Virginia fared better than some of the other battleships that day.
Pearl Harbor's interesting. Like, in the first Ian Toll book, he kind of points out how there's sort of a silver lining to it in that a lot of the ships that are totally taken out of action, like your Arizonas, your Oklahomas, are these big, slow,
old battleships.
And in a sense, it kind of speeds up the U.S. Navy. The Navy is now even more reliant on carrier groups, which, you know, are faster, that they're more dangerous, like in terms of engaging the enemy. Yeah, like symbolically, yes, it does suck to have your main harbor attacked and have all these big ships sunk. But at the same time, it sort of forces the U.S. Navy to adapt to what is going to be the modern style of fighting a naval war.
Yeah. So while still attached to the Indianapolis's crew, Miller was used for war bond drives and toured around the United States. So obviously, you're going to make a celebrity out of him. You might as well use him. And also, for those that don't know, USS Indianapolis, just look it up. We might talk about it one day. Who knows? Wouldn't want to have been on that one either, eventually.
No.
Although in 1941, you're good to go.
Yeah, that's when you'd want to be on it, I guess.
On May 15th, 1943, Miller was assigned to a new vessel, the escort carrier USS Liscome Bay. And that brings us back to the Liscome Bay. After her launching and commissioning, her first task was to make way to San Francisco and to pick up a load of 60 aircraft, which she would ferry to San Diego, where she would arrive on September 22nd, 1943. So here you see her in kind of the cargo role. It was there on October 11th that she was designated the flagship of Carrier Division 24, commanded by Rear Admiral Henry M. Mullenix. On October 14th, she would receive her complement of aircraft, and on October 21st, she would leave for Pearl Harbor, arriving on October 27th. While in Hawaii, she would be conducting additional training until about early November. And at that point, she would be assigned to be a part of Operation Corbash. Have you seen that operation name at all?
I don't think that name has come up.
Well, it gets weird.
Toll uses Operation Galvanic is the one that he always refers to in his.
Yeah, it gets weird because some sources only called it Corbash, but others call it both because Corbash is the Army's portion of Galvanic.
That would make sense then.
So it gets weird. I think sometimes people use them interchangeably almost when they shouldn't be. But Corbash is part of Galvanic, is my understanding. Is the Army portion of it. Which is also interesting seeing the Army in the Pacific because I don't feel like they get as much credit as the Marines. But the Army did a lot of the island hopping and amphibious work as well.
Oh, there's a part that I added to the notes for later where it gets into how do the Marines take these islands and how does the Army take these islands? Because it does develop into a sort of a rift, like doctrinally between how should we be doing this? And actually, it kind of ties into possibly why the Liscome Bay ends up with the fate that it ends up with.
Why it's on this show. So, as we said, Operations Galvanic and Corbash, these are the code names for the planned invasion of the Gilbert Islands. This includes the battles of Tarawa and Makin. So, that's some heavy hitters in here.
Going into like reading all about all this stuff, Tarawa was one of the few that I knew any sort of details about already. But yeah, that's like one of those big names, I feel like. If you've read anything about the Pacific War.
Japan had seized these islands 3 days after the attacks on Pearl Harbor. There was also an established seaplane base on Makin. The Allies knew that they would need to hold these islands in order to continue their march towards the Japanese home islands. Again, you're just trying to reverse the tide. And if Makin Island sounds familiar, if you've listened to Lions Led by Donkeys lately, there had been a previous Marine raid on Makin Island. This is also what appears in Call of Duty World at War, when Kiefer Sutherland yells at you the whole time.
Oh.
So Liscome Bay and Carrier Division 24.
It is interesting with this island hopping campaign. If you pull up a map of like the South Pacific and you can literally just trace your way sort of up these island chains from island to island that like its name you recognize. Like here's Guadalcanal, here's Tarawa, here's
you start
Saipan.
To see the path, that like they took.
It is funny just how almost comically accurate Yamamoto's prediction is about this from the beginning of the war. He's reluctant to even carry out the attack on Pearl Harbor, but he's ordered to do so. And so he's like, okay, if we're going to do it, this is what we need to do. We need to force the United States to end the war like immediately. Because if we don't, they are just going to grind us down with their production power and push us off island by island by island until they're in Japan itself. And it's like, that is what happens.
But worse, actually.
Like,
just didn't know about nuclear bombs yet.
yeah.
Liscome Bay and Carrier Division 24 were assigned to Task Force 10 and departed Hawaii on November 10th. Task Force 10 was commanded by Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner. Does anybody remember that name?
This is Kelly Turner, right?
Yes.
Okay.
This is the same Admiral Turner we discussed in episode 125, who coordinated the immediate response to the Westlock disaster. He's also the one that held on to intelligence about the potential imminent attack on Pearl Harbor. And if you remember our discussion in the Westlock episode, Turner turned out to be a much better amphibious operations commander than handler of intelligence. I think it's interesting when you start doing multiple stories in this time period and you're reading more, you start to get a lot more familiar with the names and the people and seeing them in different contexts. And that if all you know about Turner is his handling of the island hopping campaign, you're like, he's a pretty competent guy. He seems like he knows what's going on. And then you just look at his handling of some of the pre-war intelligence stuff. And like, maybe he just learned a lesson from that and it got better, but it doesn't seem like it's even the same guy.
Like in any situation, it's like people have strengths and weaknesses. And if you only look at like one episode from a person's career, you can form this immediate opinion of them that probably isn't accurate or wouldn't have been accurate to people at the time.
Mm-hmm. Liscome Bay was tasked with supporting the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division as they landed on Makin Atoll. The famous 69th Infantry Regiment was part of this group. This is one of the most decorated Army units that exists in the United States. They had fought in the Civil War,
Yay.
World War I,
Yay.
World War II.
Yay.
They also fought in the Iraq War.
Boo.
So yeah, it is a pretty decorated unit with a pretty long lineage and everything. It's interesting. In total, the American forces consisted of 6,470 men, 3 escort carriers, 4 outdated battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, and various smaller vessels such as destroyers and supply ships. So, you know, this is, I think what's interesting here is like, this isn't Midway, this isn't Iwo Jima. Like, this is like a secondary thing, the B operation, but also still a lot of people and a lot of danger and a lot of death goes on here.
The different prongs of the Pacific campaign, like you've got this Central Pacific campaign, you've got this Southern Pacific campaign, and then you've even got like the British in New Guinea who are operating, and they can kind of use a distraction as well from, you know, something that'll...
It is interesting seeing how it all works together to combat it. And the places where it's like, not just go around and leave that. We're not even going to mess with this island. It's interesting.
Great example being Rabaul.
Japanese forces defending the island consisted of around 800 men. However, around 300 or less were trained combat troops. Breakdown I got was 284 Japanese Marines, 108 aviation personnel, 276 construction workers, and then 3 light tanks with a small detachment of tanker crewmen. So I would assume that the Japanese Marines and the tank crew are like the only actual fighting personnel. So all of these units are under the command of Lieutenant Seizo Ishikawa. And in addition to that, there is 1 Japanese submarine operating in the vicinity. The Japanese had plenty of time to prepare for the invasion, and they constructed strong points and defensive positions throughout the island, but centered their defenses on the lagoon shore near the seaplane base. The air campaign against Makin started on November 13th, 1943, with the initial strikes being carried out by B-24 bombers of the 7th Air Force, operating out of the Ellis Islands. The escort carriers Coral Sea, Corregidor, and of course the Liscome Bay were the next to get in on the action. These carriers launched their Wildcat fighters to provide cover for the Dauntless dive bombers and Grumman Avengers that they carried. All of these are Casablanca-class escort vessels, by the way. So what you can see is they're kind of layering this. First, you have the heavy bombers come in, you know, see what they can stir up. And then after that clears, you bring in the lighter stuff for a little bit more precision, or as much precision as you can have in 1943. After that, it's time for the large naval guns on the cruisers and the elderly battleships to open up. And like, although old, these are large guns on a battleship. They're still adequate to take out like a fixed position, especially if it's just dug into the ground or something. If you're not talking about like reinforced concrete and stuff like that, like this can still, it'll make you have a bad day. Unfortunately, one of the large guns on board the USS Mississippi malfunctioned and exploded, killing 43 sailors while this bombardment's going on. It's amazing that these kind of things happen and like there's no like notes on this. Like I've never heard of this before. That would be breaking news for a month. There'd be a congressional investigation today. The Mississippi was a New Mexico class battleship that originally been built in 1915. However, she ultimately wouldn't be decommissioned until 1956. That is a long service life on that thing.
It is.
I'd imagine some of that's just spent as like reserve, but still. It was not until 8:30 a.m. on November 20th that the first American troops would assault the beach. So when did this begin? This started on the 13th, and they don't even try to land troops until the 20th. So they've spent a week of air raids, of bomber raids, and shelling with heavy naval guns. That has to be pretty surreal if you're the Japanese defenders.
It is, and I know with Makin and with Tarawa also, I think it was the Marine General Holland Smith who sort of afterwards was kind of the mindset is like, we need to be doing this to like every island, like every position needs this kind of treatment, leading to like, well, can we do this to every island?
Yeah.
Can we concentrate this much force on every single island that we have to capture?
Yeah, and it's interesting because like at a certain point it's diminishing returns that you can shell and shell and shell, and if you're dug in enough, other than the mental effect of the concussion and being awake, it's not hurting you.
Yeah, I mean, some of these positions, like, I mean, obviously they're underground. It's like a concrete bunker surrounded with like logs and filled in with other sort of just like material to stave off all these things. Like some of these positions can take a direct hit from one of these naval guns and be fine. Like,
so the morning of November 20th, the landings on Red Beach were initially met with little resistance, and American soldiers made quick progress inland. I think that's interesting in a lot of the Pacific battles, especially with the landings. We grew up in like the Saving Private Ryan generation, so we think of these big Normandy-style landings, and that happened. Like there was a resistance, but a lot of times there wasn't. It's interesting that a lot of times the Japanese wanted them to come in.
Yeah, there's something almost more off-putting. It's like either I know this is going to be an uncontested landing, or I know that it's going to be hell as soon as the Higgins boat door drops. Kind of that uneasiness of like, what is this going to be? Like, I can't really prepare for it. Because like you said, it's kind of equally off-putting in a different way if you're just walking up the beach on an island has Japanese defenders.
Yeah, and you've been shelling it for a week.
Where
are they?
Are they?
Yellow Beach, the landing craft began to encounter small arms and machine gun fire as they approached. Additionally, the landing teams were surprised by the tide. Although the assault took place at high tide, an error in calculation meant that soldiers had to walk in waist-deep water for nearly 250 yards. This resulted in equipment being lost and damaged due to the water. Also, you're just a really good target for a long time. Fortunately, only 3 men were lost to the Japanese defenders, and they only mounted light resistance before pulling back to defensive positions inland. Unfortunately for the attackers, the Japanese had not taken the bait, and they had not resisted the attack on Red Beach. The hope had been that they would provide resistance to Red Beach, and that the Yellow Beach assault teams would be able to basically sneak in and attack them from the rear. And I don't know if the Japanese knew that, or if it just had a cautious commander, but they did not take any of this. This meant that the Americans were left with no choice but to assault each strongpoint and take the island foot by foot. After 2 days of hard fighting, Makin was declared captured on the morning of November 23rd, 1943. The Japanese had been caught flat-footed by the attacks on the Gilbert Islands. In response to this, Admiral Minichi Koga ordered multiple submarines to respond to the area. 4 of these had been operating off of Hawaii, and 5 of them were operating around Truk and Rabaul. In total, of these submarines, 6 of them would be lost and unable to get into this theater of operation. However, one of the ones that did make it was I-175, commanded by Sunao Tabata. They would arrive in the area on November 24th, just as U.S. naval forces were beginning to leave the area after the conclusion of the Battle of Makin. The U.S. task force was about 20 nautical miles off of Makin when I-175 began to approach. So that's the interesting thing here. The battle's over. There is no fighting going on at this point.
I was also going to say here, you mentioned Mineichi Koga. At this point, this is what, November 1943?
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, Yamamoto is dead, and Koga is his replacement. So Koga's having to sort of fill some big shoes, I guess you would say. So it's like,
of the guy that literally said, "Hey, don't do this thing you're going to do."
Yeah, so now kind of being left with this mess to try and defend, caught a little bit by surprise with this campaign in the Gilberts. Although it was interesting, I remember reading in the book about how when they're gearing up for these big invasion campaigns, these island hopping campaigns, they don't exactly tell, all of the enlisted guys where they're going when they get on the boat. And so for a lot of these guys, the first time they had any inkling of what they were actually participating in was on the radio from Tokyo Rose, saying, "Say goodbye to land, boys. You won't be seeing it again. We know you're going to the Gilberts."
Yeah, that has to be weird. That does have to be weird. The task force was traveling in a circular route, and it was currently comprised of 7 destroyers, the cruiser Baltimore, battleships Pennsylvania, New Mexico, and the wounded Mississippi, and the escort carriers Corregidor, Coral Sea, and Liscome Bay. The Liscome Bay was the guide ship for the group, as she was the flagship, so she's located at the center of the formation. All the movements are kind of based around her. At the time, collision is actually regarded as the biggest cause of concern. We've seen that definitely happen before. As a result, the flotilla is not zigzagging or running any kind of an erratic course.
There's no Australian carriers here. It's safe. Not that those were their fault. I think both of them were the destroyer's fault.
4:30 in the morning, reveille sounds on board the carrier. And at 4:34, the destroyer Franks left the group to investigate a beacon that was suspected of being dropped from a Japanese plane. So a lot of early morning action here. At 4:36, the crew of the New Mexico briefly detected an object on their radar. And the important thing here is to know that it was radar, because it's kind of a misnomer that these submarines travel underwater. They really only do that when they attack in World War II. So yeah, they're detected on radar, and flight quarters are sounded at 4:50 on board the Liscome Bay. This is followed by general quarters being sounded at 5:05. I'm not 100% sure the difference, but I'm assuming flight quarters means if you're flight crew or flight personnel, you need to be ready to go. And then general quarters is more of, be where you need to be, all crew members.
Pokemon, go to your battle stations.
Pokemon, go to your battle stations. Prep work continued, and eventually there were 13 planes on deck ready for launch. Final preparations were made, and the carrier turned into the wind to launch aircraft. This put the Liscome Bay in the absolute worst possible position. She was now broadside to the I-175. You don't want to be broadside to the I-175. At 5:10 a.m., the submarine fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. 2 of these were passing close enough to the USS Coral Sea that they were sighted, but they would pass by harmlessly. A lookout on board the Liscome Bay reported seeing a torpedo heading for the ship. Seconds later, a single torpedo hit the Liscome Bay, which was in the process of launching aircraft. The torpedo impacted the starboard side aft of her engine room. This impact detonated her bomb storage magazine, resulting in a massive explosion. The stern would disintegrate. The USS New Mexico, which was over a mile away, reported that they were pelted with debris and body parts. And by 5:24, the destroyer USS Kimberly had acquired a target and launched depth charges in an attempt to scare away the submarine. That's the other thing you have to think about here, is even to think about trying to rescue people, like, you've got to get this submarine out of there. Like, you can't just start plucking people out of the water and all that. Back on board the Liscome Bay, it was obvious pretty quick that the damage was fatal. The stern of the vessel was almost completely sheared off. There was massive damage to both the hangar and flight decks, and the forward section of the hangar was fully engulfed in flames as ammunition began to cook off. Gasoline and oil coated the water and began to burn, making rescue even more difficult. Suddenly, as the ammunition cooked off all over the ship was rocked by another massive explosion.
One of the senior surviving officers reported that, from his station in flight control, he saw a column of bright orange-colored flame, with some white spots in it, like white-hot metal, extending upward perhaps 1,000 feet. Other ships in formation witnessed this large column of flame. Considerable debris fell on New Mexico, 1,500 yards from Liscome Bay.
That comes from the war damage report that was established about this incident. So when evaluating the explosion and subsequent damage, the report goes on to state,
comparison of this damage with other cases of war damage shows definitely that such an effect could not be produced by enemy submarine torpedoes alone, even if 2 or 3 had hit simultaneously, but must have been caused by a mass detonation of a large amount of explosive, such as was contained in the bomb storage space.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that they know, like, right away, like, this was not just a torpedo. That, like, a torpedo alone would probably not even sink this vessel.
There's another quote it's very similar, but it's from the Ian Toll, The Conquering Tide. Let's see. He says this is from a sailor on the destroyer Franks named Michael Back. Remembers watching in horror as the cosmic orb rose into the pre-dawn sky. We watched the whole thing, he said. We were just dumbfounded that the ship was blowing up.
Probably just a shocking thing to actually know that you're seeing.
And then he continues, the same sailor. He says it was dark out there, but I remember it was just like putting a candle out. The ball of fire was knocked out as the ship sank.
So around 5:40 a.m., destroyers Morris, Hughes, and Hull arrive on scene and find men in the oil-slicked water. A majority of those who were found were dead or in the process of dying. Like, there's not a lot of people pulled from the water here. At 6:10, another destroyer, USS Maury, that had arrived on scene, spotted twin torpedo wakes in the water. One of these would pass within 15 yards of the vessel. So this is pretty aggressive action by the submarine. Like, it's not often that submarines stick around this long, especially with this many warships. I don't know a ton about the Japanese, like, tactics and stuff, but, like, I don't think German U-boats would have done this, and maybe later in the war, but
it's a gamble, certainly, with all these destroyers and such around. Also, I would say, like, the Americans are probably just jealous that the Japanese have torpedoes that work.
That's true. A radar operator on board the New Mexico then located a submerged target, and destroyer Hull was dispatched to assist in chasing it down. The hull would be joined by fellow destroyer Gridley and would drop multiple depth charges in the area. By 8 a.m., the search was concluded. So at that point, they're pretty confident. They're good. No other issues. It looks like it took that shot and probably left. It had only been 23 minutes since the torpedo impact until the Liscome Bay had rolled over to her starboard side at 5:33 and gone under. It's incredibly quick. It reminds me of, like, the Hood or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the Lusitania. That's crazy fast for, like, even a small carrier.
Maybe like the Lusitania, it's because it hit a bunch of bombs. And
maybe. If the Lusitania had been carrying, like, high explosive artillery munitions, this is what would have happened to it, probably.
Yeah, exactly. There would have been a mushroom cloud.
It would have blown apart entirely.
So in total, 54 officers went down with the ship. That includes Captain Irving Wiltsey and Rear Admiral Henry M. Mullenix. It's not good when you're losing admirals.
Mullenix is the overall commander of this escort group, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's a big loss. 648 sailors were lost, including Doris Miller, and 23 aircraft were lost as well. Those killed in the sinking of the Liscome Bay would account for roughly 1/3 of all Americans killed during the entire Operation Galvanic. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I was surprised by that statistic from The Conquering Tide, that this one vessel accounts for such a huge chunk of people lost in this whole island operation. And it was after the island was taken.
Yeah, like that's the thing, is that this was over. Like the battle had de-escalated. Survivors were taken to Makin Lagoon, where they were soon transferred to the transport ships Leonard Wood and Naval. A few notable survivors, actually, that we have here. I had not heard of any. I had maybe heard of one of these guys, actually, before, but interesting nonetheless. Robert Kean would go on to be a prominent lawyer and United States District Judge. One of the famous things he's partly responsible for is no-fault auto accidents becoming a thing.
Like for insurance purposes?
Uh-huh. Like when you're merging and stuff.
Okay.
There were also twin brothers, William and Richard Hollister. No, they did not found the clothing chain Hollister.
That was going to be my question.
They might have been part of that family. Who knows? William died from his wounds during the sinking, and Richard was missing and presumed to have gone down with the ship. However, tragedy was not done with their family. Their older brother Lyle went missing in action and presumed dead while serving aboard the Gleaves-class destroyer USS Plunkett off the coast of Anzio. So kind of really one of those tragic stories of three brothers all being lost in the same war. The Garing-class destroyer USS Hollister, commissioned in 1946, was actually named in their honor. And lastly, we have William Woodward Jr. He would go on to be a successful banker, not baker. William and his wife Anne would go through a tumultuous marriage that ended when she shot him, claiming that she thought he was a prowler in the night. She Pistorius'd him.
I was going to say, the Oscar Pistorius.
This would be a whole true crime podcast today. It was dubbed the shooting of the century by Life magazine, and she got acquitted.
I think Life magazine could wait a couple decades, and there might be a couple other shootings of the century.
So yeah, it was like an early true crime thing that he was involved in. She definitely shot him on purpose, I think. I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Looking at kind of some of the bigger picture stuff here, Operation Galvanic highlighted some of the differences in assault doctrine between the Marines and the Army.
Oh, so this is a quote from Ian Toll in the Conquering Tide. It's going to refer to Ralph Smith, who's it's very confusing in this campaign because you have Julian Smith, Ralph Smith, and Holland Smith, who are all commanding different elements of this. Holland Smith being the Marine commander.
They'd all get the first name treatment.
If Ralph Smith's troops had moved faster to overrun Makin, perhaps the fleet could have withdrawn a day or two earlier, sparing the Liscome Bay her fate. Taking the number of casualties from all services into account, the Marine Corps doctrine of aggressive offense was to be preferred to the Army's stolid pace. Nimitz later concluded, "Nowhere has the Navy's insistence upon speed in amphibious assault been more sharply vindicated."
That is interesting that, the whole point of the Marine method is to get in there and just take it.
Sort of like flowing around strong points. Like, hey, if this is so heavily defended, we're just going to go around and, encircle it, maybe come back and get it later if we need to. And it sort of like is a microcosm of kind of the American strategy in the Pacific as a whole. Mm-hmm. There was a memoir or something from a Japanese officer who fought in the Pacific, kind of saying how the whole Japanese war plan was set up for this big clash of fleets, hoping that we could do another Battle of Tsushima Strait to the U.S. Navy, and that never really happens. You don't have this huge climactic battleship on battleship clash that they're looking for. And so rather than sort of meeting the Japanese head on, a lot of the U.S. operations are sort of like, he describes it like water flowing into cracks in like a building, saying rather than attacking where it's strongest, like just kind of flowing around and encircling and isolating these places. Like what happens with Rabaul. I mean, that's like a huge, heavily defended base, and the U.S. kind of just goes around and cuts it off. And it's not really a problem because, like, the Japanese can't get to it. They can't reinforce it. They can't
resupply it. Yeah, at a certain point, you have no fuel, no ammo.
So eventually it is taken eventually, but it's not assaulted in the same way that some of these places have to be. And then, like, another interesting thing is you mentioned, like, Truk Atoll. as one of these big Japanese bases. That's where the Yamato is for a lot of the war, along with the Musashi, her sister. And Truk Atoll has this like huge reputation in Allied minds because like we don't know that much about it. We don't have great scouting, and it builds up this reputation as this impregnable bastion that's so heavily defended with anti-aircraft guns and ships and destroyers. You know, the Japanese after the war writing was like, at no point was Truk Lagoon that heavily defended. Like pretty much at any point, a U.S. operation could have taken it. It had a nice lagoon, like that was nice. It was never this like fortress that it was made out to be in the Allied. I think it literally was called Japan's Gibraltar at one point, and he's just like, that was never the case.
So what happened to the I-175, you might be asking? First off, I see Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, maker of the I-175, and still in existence today. We know what you did.
Like any company from World War II. Didn't they also make the Zero?
Yes.
And probably several of the other planes too.
Amongst other things, yeah. On February 3rd, 1944, the Iowa-class battleship USS New Jersey detected a submerged contact east of Makin Atoll in the Marshall Islands. I have no idea if I said that correctly.
I'm going to guess that is not the native name for the island,
probably,
if there is one.
Probably not.
Probably doesn't matter.
Feels vaguely Polish, like the one Polish atoll.
It could be Dutch being over there also.
The destroyer USS Charette was sent to investigate. The contact disappeared when the destroyer was around 10,000 yards away, indicating that it was submerged. I think I previously said the New Jersey detected a submerged contact, but they detected a surface contact.
Oh, okay.
Charette was able to establish sonar contact with the object in the early hours of February 4th and would drop 8 depth charges before losing contact. The USS Fair had also been sent to investigate, and they would arrive on the scene around 12:40 a.m. They promptly fired a barrage of 10 Hedgehog projectiles. Both the Fair and the Charette heard 4 explosions consistent with a submarine sinking. Allied forces had reason to believe that this was I-175. However, Japanese sources claim that they actually sunk the RO-39, and that the USS Nicholas sank the I-175 on February 17th, 1944, northwest of the Marshall Islands. Regardless of who sank it, the submarine was declared lost on March 26, 1944, and all 100 sailors aboard were presumed dead.
What's a Hedgehog projectile?
It's just like a different kind of depth charge object. It's pretty cool looking. It looks like a hedgehog.
Oh, okay. So like
you've seen them. I know you've probably seen them in this.
So movies, this is more like a way of delivering depth charges.
Kind of. Yeah, to like shoot it out instead of just rolling it off the side.
Fired up to 24 spigot mortars. Awesome.
So as for memorials, there are a few today for the USS Liscome Bay. There's 2 stained glass panels in the Chapel of St. Cornelius on the grounds of the Valley Forge Military Academy. The museum ship Yorktown, which is an Essex-class carrier, has a memorial plaque remembering the incident. And the 4th Gerald Ford-class aircraft carrier, CVN-81, will be named after Doris Miller. So I mean, it's a cool honor to have. I mean, a cool way of recognizing a sailor who went definitely above and beyond what he had to do that day.
Mm-hmm.
It's cool to see him get that recognition. I believe he also got a Medal of Honor, like upgrade posthumously, like recently, like in the last 20 years.
I do remember him being in the news recently for something, and it could have been the carrier naming, but I think there was something else as well.
I think it might have been, I don't know if it was during Bush, like George W. or Obama, but I think he got a Medal of Honor.
I mean, just the Wikipedia shows Navy Cross, Purple Heart, and Combat Action Ribbon.
Huh, maybe not. You'd figure if they gave him maybe the aircraft carrier wasn't. Regardless, I think this was a pretty interesting story. It's cool that it matched so well with what you were reading.
Yeah, it worked out really well. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to contribute anything to this episode.
No, I thought it was good. It's an interesting story. There's so many of these stories in the Pacific, and I want to keep trying to find them. Some of the kind of B and C stories that exist out there. They're very interesting.
And actually, one of the things that I like about Toll's writing is that he obviously it's an English language history, so the focus is on the American side, slightly less on the British. But like it is fairly well balanced. You do get a lot of Japanese perspectives, Japanese accounts that you don't really get in a lot of other media about the Pacific War. And there's quite a few Japanese stories that would be worth telling on the show.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully everybody enjoyed this episode. We enjoyed creating it, and we will talk to you guys next week. Thanks for listening.